Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? That's how I lived for years. Silenced, medicated, and dismissed as a confused old woman while they plotted behind my back. I was just a burden to them until that day at the bank when $320 million appeared in an account with my name. The system crashed, security guards rushed in, and my grandson fainted right there in line. In that moment, as everyone stared at me in shock, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't losing my mind after all. They had been gaslighting me for decades. What would you do if you discovered your entire family had conspired to steal your identity, your money, and even your memories? When the truth finally emerged in that small-town courtroom, it wasn't just about the millions that had been hidden from me. It was about a web of lies so deep and twisted that it would shatter every relationship I thought I had. But the most devastating secret of all, it involved a child I was told had died at birth over 40 years ago. Follow this channel for more heartbreaking true stories that will leave you questioning who you can really trust. Like and comment where you're watching from. I read all comments and would love to know if you've ever suspected someone close to you was hiding something life-changing. I was sitting in the back seat of my daughter's car, silent as always. She was talking to her husband about the new car they would buy for their oldest son, while I, the grandmother, was being carried along like some piece of luggage to be dropped off in a corner. Nobody asked if I was cold, if I needed to stop to use the bathroom. Nothing. It was as if I had been reduced to an inconvenient presence. I had learned to keep quiet after they started calling me forgetful, confused, unstable old woman. One wrong word, and I risked being put in a home again. That morning, my youngest grandson asked me to go to the bank with him. He was excited because he was opening his first account. I went, more to breathe different air than out of any real desire. We stood in line together. When our turn came, everything started to spiral out of control. A manager from another bank across the street came running in and pointed at me, shouting. The system had crashed, and all he had managed to see before the failure was my name, linked to an account that had just been opened with a deposit of $320 million. My grandson fainted. Security guards came running. Me? I just trembled. Not because of the number, but because, in that second, I realized that something very wrong was happening, and that perhaps I was about to remember something I had fought to forget. I remember the silence that fell over the bank, people staring, the way the security guard's walkie-talkie crackled in the stillness, the manager's face, pale, confused, almost reverent, as he whispered, "Mrs. Whitaker," like I was someone important. For 57 years, I had been Edna Lynn Whitaker, the woman who cooked Sunday dinners that nobody complimented, the grandmother who knitted blankets that ended up in donation boxes, the mother-in-law whose opinion was never asked, and whose presence was tolerated only on holidays, the widow whose grief was treated like an inconvenience. There must be some mistake, I said, my voice barely audible even to myself. But the trembling in my hands betrayed me. Deep down, something cold and familiar stirred, a memory trying to surface. They helped my grandson to a chair. Poor boy. Just 19, lanky like his grandfather with that same crooked smile. He'd been so proud, standing there with his first paycheck, ready to open an account. "Grandma will bring me luck," he'd told his mother when she tried to discourage him from taking me. If only he knew. The bank manager, a woman with kind eyes and a stern mouth, took my elbow gently. "Mrs. Whitaker, would you please come with me? We need to verify some information." As I followed her to a small office, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass door. Gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, faded blue cardigan with a small coffee stain I couldn't get out, shoulders slightly stooped from years of carrying burdens no one saw. Who would believe this woman had anything to do with $320 million? The office smelled of coffee and paper. The manager offered me water, which I accepted with shaking hands. "Mrs. Whitaker," she began carefully, "our system shows that you recently opened an account at First National across the street. Is that correct?" "No," I whispered. "I haven't opened any accounts in 20 years. She nodded, making a note. "And you've never had business dealings involving large sums of money?" No inheritances, property sales, investments. Images flashed through my mind, signing papers I didn't understand, while my son-in-law stood over me, assuring me it was just routine. The way my daughter had started buying expensive things shortly after my husband died. The hushed arguments that stopped when I entered rooms. "Mrs. Whitaker," the manager prompted. My words were cut short by commotion outside. My daughter had arrived, her voice sharp as she demanded to know what was happening. Through the glass, I could see her. Designer purse, perfect hair, the diamond earrings she'd started wearing last year. Earrings I'd never seen before. The door burst open. "Mother!" she exclaimed, voice dripping with false concern. "What have you done now? I'm so sorry," she said to the manager, not looking at me. "My mother gets confused, early-stage dementia. We've been trying to get her proper care." The lie hung in the air between us. I wasn't confused. I'd never been diagnosed with dementia, but I'd heard her tell that lie before, to doctors, to neighbors, to family friends, each time making me doubt my own mind a little more. The manager looked at me, then at my daughter. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said, addressing me directly, "your account at First National shows a deposit of $320 million made 3 days ago. The transaction triggered security protocols. Their manager recognized your name from documents he processed recently and came to confirm your identity." My daughter's face changed just for a second, before the mask of concern slipped back into place. But I caught it, a flash of something like fear. "That's impossible," she laughed too loudly. "My mother has nothing. Dad left everything to me when he passed. She lives with us because she can't afford to live alone." Another lie. Richard had been careful with money our entire marriage. There had been a will, a substantial one. But after the funeral, when I asked about it, they told me he'd changed it. I never saw proof. The manager looked at her computer screen. According to the records, the funds came from an offshore account registered to Whitaker Holdings, LLC, established 30 years ago. She looked up at me. "By your husband, Richard Whitaker." The room seemed to tilt. 30 years ago, when Richard worked those late nights. When he took those business trips I wasn't allowed to ask about. When he'd hold me close at night and whisper, "One day, Edna, one day we'll be free." My grandson appeared at the door, still pale but standing. His eyes met mine, confused, questioning. Behind him stood the manager from First National holding a folder, and behind them, just entering the bank, was a police officer. In that moment, I made a decision. For 30 years, I'd been silent, accepting, believing I was what they told me I was, forgetful, confused, a burden. But sitting there, with all eyes on me, I straightened my shoulders and felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Power. "Yes," I said clearly, surprising even myself. "I believe those funds are mine, and I think it's time we found out where they came from." My daughter's face drained of color, and for the first time in years, I wasn't the one who looked afraid. While they fanned me with an old magazine and someone called an ambulance, my name continued flashing on the screens. The managers exchanged nervous glances, whispering to each other. One of them looked at me and cautiously asked, "Ma'am, can you confirm that you are Edna Lynn Whitaker?" I nodded, not understanding. "And that you reside at 106 Mill Creek?" My eyes filled with tears. That house had been sold more than 20 years ago. It was where my brother lived. I felt the cool air from the magazine against my face, a stark contrast to the heat rising within me. The bank's fluorescent lights seemed to intensify, making everything appear harsh and unreal. The young assistant who was fanning me had kind eyes, the only kindness I'd seen in months, and she whispered, "Just breathe, ma'am. The paramedics will be here soon." But I didn't need paramedics. I needed answers. My daughter arrived minutes later, furious. Her heels clicked aggressively across the marble floor like tiny hammers, each step an accusation. The navy blue designer suit she wore, one I'd never seen before, looked expensive, too expensive for a high school administrator's salary. "Mother!" she shouted from across the lobby, drawing all eyes to us. "What have you done now?" The way she said "now," as if I had a history of causing scenes, of being difficult. But I had always been the opposite, compliant, quiet, invisible. Mrs. Reynolds, the bank manager greeted her using her married name. There seems to be some confusion regarding your mother's financial situation. My daughter's face tightened, her carefully applied makeup creasing around her eyes. My mother doesn't have a financial situation, she said with a forced laugh. She lives with us. She has a small pension that goes directly into my account to cover her expenses. Another lie. My pension had been substantial until 3 years ago, when she convinced me to sign some papers during one of my confused episodes. Well, the manager said carefully, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. According to our records, Mrs. Whitaker has significant assets. My daughter snatched the paper, her eyes scanning it rapidly. I watched as the color drained from her face. For a moment, just a moment, her mask slipped, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Fear. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice higher than normal. There must be some mistake. My mother can barely remember what day it is. I felt my grandson's hand touch mine. He had recovered from his fainting spell but remained silent, watching the scene unfold with wide, uncertain eyes. His touch gave me strength, a reminder that not everyone in my family saw me as merely a burden or a resource to be exploited. Actually, I said, my voice stronger than it had been in years, I remember quite a lot. The words surprised even me. For so long I had played the role they had assigned me, confused, dependent, grateful for their reluctant care. But sitting there, with all eyes on me, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The police officer who had entered the bank approached our group. His badge read, Officer Daniels, and his expression was carefully neutral. I understand there's a situation regarding unusual account activity. Before my daughter could speak, I said, yes, there is, and I believe it may be connected to some papers I was asked to sign by my niece several years ago. I remembered that day clearly now. My niece Rachel, with her flashy jewelry and calculating eyes, coming to visit with an unusual level of affection. The fancy pen she'd handed me. The strange look from the bank attendant when I signed. The way Rachel had rushed me out afterward, saying we were late for lunch, a lunch we never actually had. What papers? The officer asked, taking out a small notebook. I don't know exactly, I admitted. But I remember Rachel, my niece, said it was just updating some banking information. She wore a gold bracelet with little charms that jingled when she moved. I remember thinking it was too loud for a bank. My daughter laughed, that dismissive sound I'd grown to dread. See, she remembers jewelry, but not what she signed. This is exactly what we deal with at home. But Officer Daniels didn't laugh. Instead, he looked at me with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Respect. Mrs. Whitaker, would you recognize this niece in a photograph? I nodded. Of course. Rachel is my brother's daughter. She has his eyes. The bank manager, who had been typing rapidly at her computer, looked up. There's more, she said quietly. The company that deposited the funds, Whitaker Holdings, lists Rachel Whitaker as CFO. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Rachel had no business experience that I knew of. Her husband worked in construction. How had she become CFO of a company I'd never heard of? A company that apparently had my name on it? For the first time in 3 years, people were listening to me, believing me, seeing me as a person, not just a problem to be managed or an asset to be controlled. I'd like to make a statement, I said, sitting up straighter. And I'd like to see all records associated with my name, every account, every transaction, every signature. My daughter stepped forward, her hand gripping my shoulder with unnecessary force. Mother, you're confused. We should get you home and... No, I said firmly, removing her hand. I'm not confused. And I think it's time we found out exactly what's been happening to my money. The officer nodded, writing in his notebook. We certainly will, Mrs. Whitaker. For the first time in years, I felt something powerful stirring inside me. Hope. And beneath that hope, something even more dangerous. Anger. I was escorted to a private room. The police wanted to confirm my identity. I showed my documents, trembling. The bank manager explained that the $320 million account had been created 3 weeks ago, with a single deposit coming from a company in Delaware, a company registered in my name, But I knew nothing about this. The room they led me to felt like a confessional box, small, intimate, with wood-paneled walls that absorbed sound, a place for secrets. The air conditioner hummed softly, cooling the beads of sweat that had formed along my hairline. My grandson had wanted to come with me, but my daughter had insisted he stay outside with her. I could hear her voice through the door, sharp, insistent, demanding to speak to a supervisor. Officer Daniels sat across from me at a small table, his notebook open. Next to him, the bank manager, Miss Prescott, according to her nameplate, typed quietly on a laptop. The gentle click of keys felt like a countdown to something I couldn't name. "Mrs. Whitaker," Officer Daniels began, his voice softer than I expected from a man his size. "I need to understand exactly what's happened here. When was the last time you opened a bank account?" I thought carefully. 1983, I said finally. "After my husband Richard died, I opened an account at First Federal. It's the same one I use today, though they've been bought by 3 different banks since then." Miss Prescott looked up from her screen. "And that's your only account?" "As far as I know," I replied, smoothing my skirt with trembling hands. The polyester fabric felt rough against my palms, a $12.99 skirt from the clearance rack at Ross. Nothing like the tailored outfit my daughter wore. Officer Daniels made a note. "And you've never heard of Whitaker Holdings, LLC?" I shook my head. "Never." Miss Prescott turned her laptop towards me. "This is the documentation for the account at First National. It was opened in your name 3 weeks ago, with all the proper identification." She scrolled down to the signature line. "Is this your signature, Mrs. Whitaker?" I leaned forward, squinting through my bifocals. My heart skipped a beat. There it was, my name written in my handwriting. The distinctive way I looped the E in Edna, the slight slant to the right. It was unmistakable. That's my handwriting," I whispered, confusion washing over me. "But I don't remember signing this. I haven't been to First National in years." Officer Daniels exchanged a glance with Miss Prescott. "Mrs. Whitaker, has anyone asked you to sign documents recently? Perhaps saying they were for something else?" I tried to think, pressing my fingertips against my temples. There had been so many papers over the years. Medical forms, insurance documents, the papers transferring my house into my daughter's name for estate planning purposes. I'd signed so many things without reading them carefully, trusting my family to look after my interests. "My my niece," I corrected myself, the Portuguese word for niece slipping out as it sometimes did when I was nervous. "Rachel came to visit about a month ago. She brought some papers, said they were related to my brother's estate." I paused, remembering. She seemed nervous, kept checking her watch. Officer Daniels nodded encouragingly. "Did you read what you were signing?" Shame washed over me. "No," I admitted quietly. "My reading glasses were upstairs, and Rachel said it was just formalities, that the lawyer needed my signature to release some small items my brother had left me." The police officer casually commented, almost offhandedly, "Ma'am, do you have a diagnosis of advanced dementia, correct?" I froze. Those words hit me like a physical blow. The room seemed to tilt slightly. "No," I said firmly. "I do not have dementia. My daughter says I do, but no doctor has ever diagnosed me with it." Miss Prescott looked surprised. "But the paperwork for the account lists you as having a caretaker due to cognitive impairment. Your daughter is named as having power of attorney." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The doctor's appointments my daughter had taken me to, where she did all the talking, the medications that made me foggy and compliant, the way my mail disappeared before I could read it. "I take medication," I said slowly. "Pills my daughter gives me. They make me confused sometimes. Sleepy." I looked up, meeting Officer Daniels' eyes directly. "But when I don't take them, like today, my mind is clear." Something shifted in Officer Daniels' expression. Concern, perhaps, or suspicion. He made another note. Miss Prescott cleared her throat. "Mrs. Whitaker, the documentation for Whitaker Holdings shows it was established 30 years ago by Richard Whitaker, your late husband." I shook my head in disbelief. "That's impossible." Richard would have told me. Not necessarily, Officer Daniels said gently. Sometimes people keep financial matters separate, especially in that generation. I thought about my marriage, the comfortable partnership we'd shared, the small decisions we made together about household expenses. But there had been those business trips I wasn't to ask about, the late-night phone calls he took in his study with the door closed, the safety deposit box key I'd never been given. The door opened, and a younger officer entered with a folder. He handed it to Officer Daniels, who opened it and studied its contents. His eyebrows rose slightly. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said carefully, "these are the incorporation documents for Whitaker Holdings. They list your husband as founder and you as successor. And there's a note here about something called Project Sanctuary." The name struck a chord, a distant memory of Richard whispering those words into a phone late at night. I'd asked him about it once, and he'd kissed my forehead and said, "Just a backup plan, my love, just in case." Officer Daniels placed a document on the table and pointed to a signature at the bottom. "Is this your signature, Mrs. Whitaker?" I leaned forward again. This signature was different, slightly messier with a different slant to the letters. It looked like my handwriting from 20 years ago, before arthritis had stiffened my fingers. "That's my signature," I said slowly. "But it's old. Very old." The door burst open again, and my grandson stood there, his young face flushed with emotion. "Grandma," he said breathlessly, "Mom's on the phone with Aunt Rachel. They're fighting. I heard Mom say something about the old woman finding out." The old woman. That's what I was to them, not a mother, not a person with thoughts and feelings, just an old woman, a problem, an asset. In that moment, a realization crystallized. I had been signing papers for years without understanding what they were. Someone, perhaps several someones, had been using my name, my identity, to access money I never knew existed. And they had been doing it by convincing everyone, including me at times, that I couldn't trust my own mind. My grandson came to my side, his hand finding mine. Unlike his mother, he looked at me, really looked at me, and saw a person, not a burden. "Grandma," he whispered, "what's going on?" I squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his presence. "I don't know yet, sweetheart, but we're going to find out." Officer Daniels closed the folder. "Mrs. Whitaker, I think we need to investigate this further. It appears someone may have been using your identity fraudulently." I nodded, straightening my shoulders. For years I'd been shrinking, becoming smaller, less visible. But now, with each piece of information, I felt myself expanding, reclaiming the space I'd surrendered. "Yes," I said firmly. "Someone has, and I want to know who." My grandson's grip tightened on mine. He looked at me differently now, with curiosity, with questions, as if seeing his grandmother for the first time and wondering if she was victim or villain. In the days that followed, I was isolated from everything. My daughter forbade me from leaving the house, took away my cell phone, hid my clothes, and locked me in the back room. They started giving me those pink pills again that left me confused and drowsy, but I pretended to take them. I began to overhear conversations through the crack in the door. They talked about fund release, advance signature, lost will, and my brother-in-law's name, deceased 2 years ago, came up as a warning. The small bedroom at the back of my daughter's house had become my prison. The walls were painted a pale yellow that was meant to be cheerful, but only intensified the sense of confinement. A single window looked out onto the backyard, but it had been fitted with a child safety lock, supposedly to protect me from wandering off, as if I were a toddler rather than a woman who had raised 3 children and buried a husband. I sat on the edge of the narrow twin bed, feeling the springs creak beneath me. The mattress was old, a cast-off from my grandson's childhood bedroom. The sheets smelled of mothballs and disuse. A water stain on the ceiling resembled a map of Florida, and I often found myself staring at it, trying to identify the cities and coastlines in its irregular shape. Anything to keep my mind active. The pink pills sat in a neat row under my pillow, 15 of them now, carefully collected over 5 days of pretending to swallow them. When my daughter brought my medication, I would place it under my tongue and later spit it out when she left. It was an old trick I'd learned from a movie, but it worked. With each day that passed without the medication, my mind grew sharper, memories surfacing like bubbles in clear water. Outside my door, voices drifted down the hallway from the kitchen. My daughter and her husband arguing in those urgent half-whispers people use when they don't want to be overheard but can't contain their emotions. "We need to move faster," my son-in-law hissed. "If she starts talking to people—" "She won't," my daughter cut in. "Mom doesn't have anyone to talk to. We've made sure of that." The casual cruelty of those words pierced me. They had systematically isolated me over the years, hadn't they? Friends who stopped calling, invitations that never arrived, letters that disappeared. I had attributed it all to people's discomfort with aging, with illness, but perhaps there had been a more deliberate design to my loneliness. "That detective called again," my son-in-law said, his voice tightening. "He wants to interview her alone." "Absolutely not," my daughter snapped. "She's not mentally competent. Her doctor will confirm that." Dr. Levine, the specialist who had seen me exactly twice but who signed all my prescriptions, the man whose eyes never quite met mine during examinations, who directed all his questions and explanations to my daughter as if I were invisible or incapable of understanding. "And what about Rachel?" my son-in-law asked. "She's panicking." A heavy sigh from my daughter. "Rachel needs to calm down. She's the one who convinced Uncle James to set this whole thing up in the first place." Uncle James, my brother-in-law, the man who had been so attentive after Richard died, who had helped with the funeral arrangements, who had sat beside me during those dark days of grief when I could barely function, the man who had taken me to a notary and asked me to sign some papers. Just routine legal matters, Edna. Nothing to worry your pretty head about. I pressed my ear closer to the door, desperate not to miss a word. "If the police start digging into James's affairs," my son-in-law began. "They won't," my daughter interrupted. "He's been dead for 2 years, and everything was transferred legally. The problem is this sudden activity on the account. Rachel promised that money would stay untouched until we were ready." $320 million, my son-in-law whispered, his voice tinged with awe. "Jesus, Carol, did you know it was that much?" "No," my daughter admitted. "Uncle James said it was a substantial inheritance that Dad had hidden from the IRS. But this is beyond anything I imagined." My heart pounded against my ribs. Richard had hidden money? My practical, honest husband, who insisted on reporting even the smallest income from his woodworking hobby on our taxes. It didn't make sense. Unless it wasn't his money to begin with. A memory surfaced. Richard taking a phone call late one night, his face pale in the blue glow of the kitchen light. "I can't be part of this anymore, James," he had said. "It's wrong and you know it." They had argued, voices rising until Richard noticed me standing in the doorway and abruptly hung up. The next morning he had told me he was considering early retirement. 6 months later, he was dead. Heart attack, they said. Unexpected. A tragedy. The conversation in the kitchen continued, but softer now, the words indistinct. I returned to my bed, mind racing. What had James involved Richard in? What was Project Sanctuary? And why had they all worked so hard to make me believe I was losing my mind? I thought of my youngest grandson, the only one who still looked me in the eye, who spoke to me as a person rather than an obligation. He had visited my room each night, slipping in quietly after his parents were asleep. He brought me small treasures, a chocolate bar, a magazine, once even a prepaid cell phone that I had been too afraid to use. Last night, he had whispered through the door that he had overheard something strange. Mom and Dad were fighting about Uncle Ray, he had said. Dad called him a liability, and Mom said they needed to contain the situation. What does that mean, Grandma? Ray, my middle child, the sensitive one, the one who had moved to Oregon 5 years ago after a bitter argument with his sister, the one who rarely called anymore, and when he did, always seemed to catch me on my confused days. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Ray hadn't abandoned me. He had been pushed away, deliberately, because he would have noticed what was happening to me, because he would have asked questions. A soft knock at my door startled me from my thoughts. My grandson's face appeared in the narrow opening, his eyes wide with concern. "Grandma," he whispered urgently, I heard Dad on the phone. They're planning to move you to some place called Sunny Pines tomorrow, a nursing home. The threat they had held over me for years, the final step in erasing me completely. They said it's for your own good. He continued, his voice breaking slightly. But I don't believe them. I reached out and took his hand, feeling the smooth skin and strong fingers of youth. Neither do I said softly, and I need your help. For the first time in years, someone was on my side. Not because I was a burden to be managed or an asset to be controlled, but because I was a person who deserved to be heard, to be believed. What can I do? He asked, determination replacing the uncertainty in his young face. I squeezed his hand. I need you to make a phone call. With my grandson's help, who began to suspect his own mother, I managed to have him search for an old box hidden behind the heater in my former house. Inside, among yellowed photographs, was an envelope with a California state stamp. It was my husband's original will. In it, he left everything to me and acknowledged the existence of a son we had who didn't survive. At least, that's what they said. The rain tapped against the window like impatient fingers as I waited for my grandson to return. I had sent him on a desperate mission to my old house, the Victorian on Maple Street, that Richard and I had lovingly restored over 30 years of marriage. The house my daughter had convinced me to sign over to her 3 years ago for tax purposes. The house where I had raised my children, buried my sorrows, celebrated my joys. The minutes crawled by, each one stretching into a small eternity. Had he been caught? Had my daughter intercepted him? I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, straining to see through the curtain of rain for any sign of his return. A flash of lightning illuminated the backyard, casting strange, elongated shadows across the sodden grass. In that brief, electric moment, I saw a figure darting along the fence line, tall, slender, moving with purpose. My heart leapt. He had made it back. Moments later, there was a soft tap at my door, followed by my grandson's whispered, "Grandma, it's me." I opened the door to find him standing there, soaked to the skin, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, clutching a metal box to his chest. His eyes were wide with excitement or fear, perhaps both. "I found it," he whispered, pushing past me into the room. "Right where you said it would be, behind the old furnace in the basement." My hands trembled as I took the box from him. It was heavier than I remembered, the metal cold and slightly rusted around the edges. The key, the small brass key I had kept hidden inside my wedding ring for the past 3 years, fit perfectly into the lock. Inside lay the physical remnants of my life with Richard, our marriage certificate, yellowed with age, photographs of us as a young couple, full of hope and dreams, Richard's service medals from Vietnam, and at the bottom, a sealed envelope with the official stamp of the state of California. "What is it?" my grandson asked, peering over my shoulder. "The truth," I whispered, breaking the seal with shaking fingers. The document inside was dated June 15th, 1989, 3 months before Richard's death. It was his last will and testament, properly notarized and witnessed. I skimmed through the legal jargon until I reached the critical section. "I, Richard Allen Whitaker, being of sound mind, do hereby bequeath all my worldly possessions, assets, and interests to my beloved wife, Edna Lynn Whitaker. This includes, but is not limited to, our family home, all bank accounts held in my name or jointly, my pension and life insurance benefits, and my full ownership stake in Whitaker Holdings, LLC." My breath caught. There it was, Whitaker Holdings, in Richard's own will. But it was the next paragraph that made my blood run cold. I also acknowledged the existence of my son, Thomas Richard Whitaker, born May 3rd, 1976, whose birth certificate lists him as deceased, but who was, in fact, placed for adoption through arrangements made by my brother James Whitaker, without the knowledge or consent of my wife Edna. The paper slipped from my fingers, floating to the floor like a fallen leaf. My grandson scooped it up, his eyes scanning the words that had just shattered my world. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice strangled with emotion. "What does this mean? We had a son I had been told died at birth, a son who would be 47 years old now, a son who had been taken from me while I lay unconscious from a difficult delivery and grief medication. And the name of that son was the same as my grandson's name. My legs gave way, and I sank onto the bed. The room seemed to spin around me, decades of lies unraveling at once. The nervous breakdown I supposedly had after losing the baby, the medications that made me compliant and foggy, the gradual isolation from friends and family. It had all been part of a plan to keep me from discovering the truth. "Thomas," I said, looking at my grandson with new eyes. Not my grandson at all, but my... No, it couldn't be. The timing wasn't right, but perhaps... "Mom named me after her uncle," he said slowly, putting the pieces together. "She always said it was a family name. A family name indeed. My son's name. The son who had been stolen from me. We need to take this to the bank manager," I said, gathering the documents with trembling hands. "And to Officer Daniels." My great-grandson nodded, his young face solemn with the weight of what we had discovered. "I'll help you," he promised. "They can't keep doing this to you." Together we carefully repacked the box, hiding the will in the lining of my old coat where no one would think to look. Tomorrow, when they took me to the bank to sign the papers transferring the mysterious account, papers I had no intention of signing, I would have proof of my husband's true wishes, proof that I wasn't confused or delusional, proof that I had been the victim of a decades-long conspiracy. As Thomas helped me hide the box, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the small mirror on the wall. The woman looking back at me wasn't the fragile, uncertain person I had been forced to become. In her eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: determination, clarity, strength. The bank manager read the document in silence. Then he looked at me with an expression I will never forget: respect and fear. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said carefully, "this changes everything." Behind him, I could see my daughter's face, watching through the glass partition of the office, her expression a mixture of fury and panic. She knew. She had always known. "Yes," I replied, straightening my shoulders. "It certainly does. For the first time in years, I wasn't asking for permission or forgiveness. I was demanding justice, and the truth, no matter how painful, was finally coming to light." Thomas squeezed my hand under the table, a silent promise of support. In that moment, I realized that while I had lost a son without ever knowing him, I had gained something unexpected: an ally, someone who saw me not as a burden or a means to an end, but as a person deserving of dignity and truth. The rain had stopped outside, and sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. A new day, a new beginning, and perhaps, somewhere out there, a son who might yet be found. My daughter organized a party to celebrate the family's financial good fortune. I wasn't invited. But from my little room I heard the laughter, the music, the toasts. They were celebrating my downfall. I thought my grandson was with them, until he appeared with tears in his eyes and handed me something. A recording of his mother and uncle discussing how they would commit the useless old lady to a home before she could say more than she should. The muffled sounds of celebration filtered through the walls of my prison. Crystal glasses clinking, expensive heels clicking on hardwood floors, bursts of laughter that rose and fell like waves. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed, hands folded in my lap, listening to them toast their success over my ruination. The party had started at 7. I knew because I'd heard my daughter instructing the caterers, telling them where to set up the champagne fountain, which vintage to serve with the canapes. "Nothing but the best tonight," she'd said, her voice giddy with excitement. "We have something special to celebrate. Something special indeed. The imminent transfer of what was rightfully mine into their greedy hands. The final victory in their years-long campaign to erase me as a person. The bedroom they'd relegated me to shared a wall with the formal dining room, allowing me to hear fragments of conversation between music tracks. My son-in-law's booming laugh. My daughter's high, brittle voice directing the servers. My niece Rachel's distinctive nasal tone as she complimented the decor. To new beginnings, someone toasted. followed by enthusiastic agreement and the delicate sound of crystal meeting crystal. New beginnings built on stolen legacies, on lies and manipulation, on making an old woman believe she was losing her mind. I pressed my ear against the wall, straining to hear more. A man's voice, my nephew-in-law, I thought, was speaking about offshore accounts and untraceable transfers. Someone shushed him, but the damage was done. They were discussing their plans openly now, confident that I was safely contained, heavily medicated, no threat to their schemes. But they had underestimated me. Again. The pink pills that should have left me docile and confused were hidden in a small hole I'd made in my mattress. 21 of them now. 3 weeks' worth of clarity instead of chemical fog. And in that clarity, I had remembered who I was before they started chipping away at my identity. A woman who had run a household, raised children, supported a husband through career changes and health scares. A woman with opinions and agency and strength. A sharp knock at my door startled me from my thoughts. I froze, terrified that my daughter had come to check on me, to force another pill down my throat. But when the door cracked open, it was Thomas's face that appeared. My grandson, my ally, my lifeline to the world outside this room. "Grandma," he whispered, slipping inside and closing the door softly behind him. His young face was flushed, his eyes wet with unshed tears. "I can't stand it anymore." "What's happening?" I asked, patting the space beside me on the bed. He sat heavily, the springs creaking beneath his weight. "They're all out there celebrating like they've won the lottery. Mom's wearing a new diamond necklace. Uncle Brett is talking about buying a yacht." His voice cracked with emotion. "They're acting like vultures who've spotted a dying animal." The image was apt, if painful. I had been dying in a way, not physically, but as a person, diminished daily by their treatment until I barely recognized myself. "I thought I was supposed to be at the party," I said softly. "After all, it's my money they're celebrating." Thomas shook his head. "Mom told everyone you weren't feeling well, that your condition was acting up." He spat the word condition with such venom that I knew he no longer believed the lies they'd told about me. He reached into his pocket and withdrew his phone, a sleek new model that probably cost more than my monthly pension. "I needed to show you something," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "I recorded them." My heart skipped a beat. "Recorded what?" "Mom and Uncle Brett. They didn't know I was in Dad's study." He tapped the screen a few times, then held the phone close to my ear. My daughter's voice emerged from the small speaker, slightly tinny but unmistakable. "Need to move quickly. That detective keeps calling, asking questions about Mom's medications. You told him she's been diagnosed with dementia, right?" My son-in-law's voice, impatient and dismissive. "Of course I did. But he wants to see medical records, Brett. Actual diagnosis paperwork. Doctor, Levine can only stall for so long." A heavy sigh from Brett. "Then we accelerate the plan. Get her into Sunny Pines by the end of the week. Once she's institutionalized, it's her word against ours, and no one listens to dementia patients." "What about Thomas?" My daughter's voice held a note of concern. "He's spending a lot of time with her. I'm worried she's telling him things." "He's 17, Carol. He'll be off to college next year. Distract him with a new car or something." A pause. Then my daughter again, her voice lower, harder. "I just want this over with. That useless old woman has been nothing but a burden for years. It's time we got what we deserve. 320 million is worth putting up with a difficult mother." Brett's laugh was cold, calculating. "Or getting rid of one." The recording ended. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the shock of hearing my own child speak of me with such callous disregard. Despite everything I'd learned, some part of me had still hoped there was an explanation, some misunderstanding that could salvage a shred of familial love. But there was no misinterpreting those words. "I'm sorry, Grandma," Thomas whispered, taking my hand in his. His skin was warm against my papery fingers. "I knew they were being awful to you, but I didn't realize how bad it was until I heard them talking like that." I squeezed his hand, gathering strength from his touch. Thank you for showing me this, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Now I know exactly what we're dealing with. What are we going to do? He asked, the we warming my heart despite the circumstances. Tomorrow, I said firmly, we're going to the police. With the will, with this recording, with everything we have. Thomas nodded, determination replacing the uncertainty in his eyes. I'll help you get out of here, early before anyone's awake. A burst of louder laughter from the dining room reminded us of the celebration continuing just feet away. My family, my flesh and blood, raising glasses to my imprisonment, my erasure, my defeat. Will you stay? I asked Thomas, suddenly afraid to be alone with my thoughts. Just for a while? Without hesitation, he stretched out on the floor beside my bed, using his jacket as a pillow. I'll stay all night, he promised. I'm not leaving you alone again. That night, as the sounds of celebration gradually faded and the house grew quiet, I listened to the steady breathing of my grandson sleeping on the floor beside me. For the first time in years, someone wanted to protect me. And for the first time in years, I felt something I had forgotten. Hope. In the morning, we would face whatever came next. Together. I was called to a hearing. The bank had frozen the funds until everything was cleared up. There the lawyer read the documents and then revealed what no one expected. The company from which the $320 million came had been created by my brother-in-law, but registered in the name of future property of the direct descendants of Edna Lynn Whitaker. The county courthouse stood like a granite sentinel against the bright blue October sky. Its imposing columns and wide stone steps gave it the air of a temple, a place where truth and justice were supposed to reign supreme. As Thomas helped me up those steps, my arthritic knees protesting with each rise, I wondered if today would finally bring the justice I'd been denied for so long. Inside, the marble floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, our footsteps echoing in the cavernous main hall. Men and women in suits rushed past us, clutching briefcases and files, too busy with their own legal battles to notice an elderly woman and her teenage grandson moving slowly toward courtroom 3. Officer Daniels met us at the door, his face professionally neutral but his eyes kind. Mrs. Whitaker, he greeted me with a slight nod. The judge is ready for you. Your daughter and niece are already inside. My stomach clenched at the thought of facing them, but I straightened my spine and lifted my chin. I was done cowering. I'm ready, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, more intimate, and thus somehow more intimidating. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, and the American flag hung limply in the corner. Judge Martinez sat behind an elevated bench, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun, her expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. To the left sat my daughter Carol, dressed in a conservative navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension. Beside her, Rachel fidgeted with her gold charm bracelet, the same one she'd worn when she'd tricked me into signing those papers. Their lawyer, a sleek man with a red tie and predatory eyes, leaned toward them whispering urgently. They didn't look at me as I entered. Not once. Thomas squeezed my hand before taking a seat in the gallery behind me. I was directed to a table on the right, where a woman with kind eyes and a sensible haircut introduced herself as Amanda Chen, the attorney appointed by the court to represent my interests. Don't worry, she whispered. I've reviewed all the evidence. Your grandson's recording, the will, the medication list. We have a strong case. The judge called the hearing to order, her gavel striking with a finality that made me flinch. This is an unusual situation, she began, peering at us over her glasses. We're here to determine the rightful ownership of funds currently held in an account at First National Bank, and to investigate allegations of elder abuse and financial exploitation. Carol's face remained impassive, but Rachel's complexion turned ashen. Their lawyer leaned forward, all sharp angles and aggressive confidence. Your Honor, my clients have been caring for Mrs. Whitaker for years. She suffers from advanced dementia and confabulation. These accusations are manifestations of her illness? Miss Chen rose smoothly to her feet. Your Honor, we have evidence that Mrs. Whitaker has been deliberately misdiagnosed and overmedicated by her family in order to gain control of her assets. We've submitted her medical records from 3 independent doctors, all of whom found no evidence of dementia or cognitive impairment once she was taken off the medications her daughter was administering. The judge nodded, making a note. I've reviewed those reports. Concerning, to say the least. She turned her gaze to me. Mrs. Whitaker, are you able to answer some questions for the court? Yes, Your Honor, I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady. Can you tell me about Whitaker Holdings and your connection to it? I took a deep breath. Until recently, I knew nothing about it. But after reviewing my late husband's will, his real will, not the falsified one my family presented after his death, I learned that he established the company 30 years ago as what he called Project Sanctuary. It was meant to be a safety net for our family. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. And this will you mentioned, where was it found? In a metal box hidden in my former home, I explained. A home I was pressured to sign over to my daughter 3 years ago. My grandson helped me retrieve it. From the corner of my eye, I saw Carol's posture stiffen. Her lawyer whispered something to her, but she shook him off with an impatient gesture. The judge turned to a thick folder before her. The court has reviewed the will in question, and it appears authentic. The notary who witnessed its signing has provided an affidavit confirming its validity. She looked up, her gaze sweeping over us. There's something else in this will that bears discussion. A reference to a child, a son born to Richard and Edna Whitaker in 1976, allegedly reported deceased, but actually placed for adoption. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even Miss E. Chen looked surprised. This was one detail I hadn't shared with her. Too raw and painful to speak aloud until now. The bank's attorney, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, rose from his seat at the third table. Your Honor, if I may, the company from which the $320 million originated, Whitaker Holdings, was registered in an unusual way. The beneficiary is listed as future property of the direct descendants of Edna Lynn Whitaker, not Mrs. Whitaker herself, but her descendants. The judge frowned. Meaning, Your Honor, that the funds belong neither to Mrs. Whitaker nor to her daughter, but to her direct bloodline, specifically to her son or his children. Silence fell over the courtroom, heavy and expectant. I felt lightheaded. Decades of lies unraveling in this sterile room under the fluorescent lights. Mrs. Whitaker, the judge asked gently, did you have a son? The question hung in the air, weighted with decades of grief and loss. My throat constricted, but I forced the words out, my voice trembling but clear. Yes, he was born on May 3rd, 1976. I was told he died during delivery, but according to my husband's will, he was taken from me, placed for adoption by my brother-in-law James, without my knowledge or consent. Carol stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is ridiculous. Mother has been confused for years. She's making this up. Sit down, Mrs. Reynolds, the judge commanded sharply. When Carol reluctantly complied, Judge Martinez continued. The court has DNA records submitted as part of this investigation. They indicate that Thomas Reynolds is not, in fact, Mrs. Whitaker's grandson. My heart seemed to stop. Not her grandson? Then who? DNA analysis confirms that Thomas Reynolds is Mrs. Whitaker's son. The words echoed in my head. Impossible. Incomprehensible. My son? The boy I'd mourned for 47 years. But he was only 17. That's impossible, Carol sputtered. Thomas is my son. I have the birth certificate to prove it. The judge's expression was grim. The DNA doesn't lie, Mrs. Reynolds. And we've uncovered evidence that the birth certificate was falsified. Thomas is not your biological child. According to the genetic markers, he is the biological son of Edna and Richard Whitaker. I turned to look at Thomas, sitting in the gallery behind me, his face a mask of shock and confusion. Our eyes met across the distance, the same deep blue eyes that had gazed up at me from his crib, that had looked to me for guidance and support for 17 years. Not my grandson at all, but my son. How? I whispered, the question directed at no one and everyone. The judge shuffled through her papers. "We're still piecing it together, Mrs. Whitaker, but it appears your son was not born in 1976 as you believed. Medical records indicate you experienced a pseudocyesis, a false pregnancy, at that time, likely brought on by stress and your desire for another child. Your brother-in-law James and his wife exploited this, convincing you that you delivered and lost a baby." I shook my head, memories fragmenting and reforming. The pregnancy had felt so real. The morning sickness, the swollen ankles, the fluttering movements inside me. The actual conception and birth occurred much later, the judge continued. In 2006, when you were 56 years old, you underwent what you were told was a routine hysterectomy. Instead, according to operative reports we've subpoenaed, eggs were harvested from you. These were fertilized with preserved sperm from your late husband, sperm that had been collected and stored before his death in 1989. The room seemed to tilt around me. It was too fantastic, too horrific to comprehend. Thomas was born via surrogate in 2007, the judge said softly, and given to your daughter to raise as her own, all orchestrated by James Whitaker before his death 2 years ago. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The son I thought I'd lost had never existed, but another son, this boy I'd loved as my grandson, had been created from Richard and me without our knowledge or consent. A final violation in a lifetime of betrayals. "Your Honor," I said, my voice hardly more than a whisper, "I need to speak with Thomas." Everyone in that courtroom fell silent as I revealed my truth with a trembling voice. "Yes, he is sitting right here beside me. He was my grandson until today, but he is my son, the result of something I never had the courage to tell." The whispers that followed were like a bomb exploding in that room, and no one dared to interrupt me. I was 19 years old. I was married, young, innocent, but one night, during a visit to my sister-in-law's house, I drank something that knocked me out. I woke up in the basement, ashamed, silent, not knowing what to do. The test came back positive weeks later. My husband believed the baby was his, but died in an accident months before the birth. My brother-in-law and sister-in-law disappeared for a while. When I returned from the maternity ward, they said my son had died. The courtroom had emptied, leaving just Thomas and me sitting side by side on a wooden bench in the hallway. The morning light streamed through tall windows, casting long rectangles of warmth across the marble floor. Neither of us had spoken for several minutes. How do you begin a conversation like this? How do you explain to someone that everything they thought they knew about themselves was a lie? Thomas stared at his hands. Richard's hands, I now realized, with the same long fingers and pronounced knuckles. My heart ached with the need to reach out to him, but I held back, uncertain of my place in his life now. Was I his mother, his grandmother, a stranger? "I remember a dream I used to have," Thomas said, suddenly, his voice low and thoughtful. "I was very small, lying in a crib, and someone was singing to me, a lullaby about stars and moonlight. The voice was, it was yours, wasn't it?" My breath caught. "Sweet child of mine," I whispered. "It was the song I sang to you every night when you were a baby. Your mother, Carol, was always working late, so I would put you to bed." I paused, the irony of those days striking me anew. I was singing to my own son without knowing it. Thomas nodded slowly, processing this impossible truth. "The judge said I was born in 2007. How could that happen without you knowing, without consent?" I took a deep breath. The time for secrets had passed. Thomas deserved the whole truth, no matter how painful. "It started long before you were born," I began, my voice steadying as I committed to telling this story I'd buried for decades. "I was 19 years old. It was 1969, and I'd been married to your father for just over a year. Richard was kind, hard-working, nothing like his older brother James." I closed my eyes, allowing myself to remember that young woman I'd once been, naive, trusting, full of hope for the future. One evening we were invited to dinner at James and Ellen's house. It was unusual. They rarely included us in their social circle. James was 15 years older than Richard, already successful in business, while we were just starting out. I swallowed hard. I remember Ellen serving me a special cocktail she'd created. It tasted strange, but I didn't want to be rude. By my second glass, the room was spinning. Thomas sat perfectly still, his face pale, but his eyes never leaving mine. I woke up in their basement. It was dark, cold. My clothes were disheveled. I felt strange, sore in places I shouldn't have been. I was confused, ashamed. When I managed to get upstairs, Ellen told me I'd had too much to drink and passed out. James drove me home, warning me not to worry Richard with silly female hysteria. My hands trembled at the memory. 3 weeks later, I realized I was pregnant. Richard was overjoyed. We'd been trying for a baby since our wedding. I never told him about that night. I couldn't bear to voice my suspicions, couldn't stand the thought of destroying his relationship with his brother. So he wasn't my biological father? Thomas asked softly. No, he was, I said firmly. The DNA tests confirmed that. Richard and I had been intimate in the days before that dinner. The timing made it impossible to know for certain back then. And Richard loved you, the idea of you, so completely from the moment I told him about the pregnancy. I paused, gathering strength for the next part of my story. But then Richard died in a car accident when I was 7 months along. James and Ellen suddenly became very involved in my life. They moved me into their guest house, insisted on driving me to all my medical appointments. When I went into labor, James was the one who took me to the hospital, a private facility I'd never heard of, not the one my doctor had arranged. The memory of that day still had the power to make my heart race with panic. Everything was a blur. They gave me something for the pain that knocked me out completely. When I woke up, a nurse told me my baby, my son, had died during delivery. I never saw your body, never got to hold you. They showed me a death certificate and a tiny blue hat, told me they'd handled all the arrangements while I was unconscious. I was devastated, broken. Thomas reached out and took my hand, a gesture so simple yet so profound that tears sprang to my eyes. For decades, I believed you had died, I continued. I mourned you every day. Richard was gone. My baby was gone. I eventually remarried and had Carol when I was 27. But I never forgot my first child, the son who I thought had lived only inside me. But I didn't die, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. They took me. I shook my head. No, that baby, the one I carried in 1969, truly didn't survive. The judge was right about that. The pregnancy was real, but the outcome was tragic. What I didn't understand until today was that James never forgot that child either, his child, as he must have believed. When I had a hysterectomy in 2006, he saw an opportunity to create me, Thomas whispered. Yes, without my knowledge, without my consent. He used my eggs, Richard's preserved sperm. James must have arranged for the collection before Richard died, perhaps anticipating medical advancements. He created you as some twisted form of legacy, or perhaps atonement, and then gave you to Carol to raise, keeping you close to me, but never revealing the truth. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, allowing me to love Thomas as a grandson while denying me the knowledge that he was actually my son, letting me believe for decades that my firstborn had died, while orchestrating an unimaginable violation of my body to create a new child from my genetic material. Does this mean Carol isn't my mother at all? Thomas asked, his voice small and lost. Biologically, no. She's your half-sister. The reality of it was still difficult to comprehend. The family tree twisted into an unnatural shape by James's machinations. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this seismic shift in his identity. Then he looked at me, really looked at me. His blue eyes, Richard's eyes, filled with a question he seemed afraid to ask. What happens now? He finally said. It was the question I'd been asking myself since the judge's revelation. What did it mean for us? How could we possibly navigate this new reality? I don't know, I admitted. I know that legally the money belongs to you. The judge made that clear. But more importantly, I hesitated, then continued softly, I know that I've loved you from the moment you were born, as my grandson then, as my son now. That hasn't changed." Thomas nodded slowly. "I've always felt different, like I didn't quite fit with Mom, with Carol and Brett. They never seemed to understand me the way you did." A small smile touched his lips. "Maybe this is why." "Perhaps," I agreed. "Blood has a way of recognizing blood, even when our minds don't understand the connection." We sat in silence again, more comfortable now, the weight between us shifting from burden to bond. Outside the courthouse windows, life continued, people rushing to appointments, cars honking in midday traffic, clouds drifting across the autumn sky. But inside, in this quiet hallway, time seemed suspended as we contemplated our shared past and uncertain future. "Would you like to come home with me?" Thomas asked suddenly. "Not to their house. I mean, we could get an apartment or something. Start over." My heart swelled with an emotion too big to name. "Yes," I said simply. "I'd like that very much." He stood and offered me his hand. My son, offering to lead me into a new chapter of our complicated lives. As I took it, I realized that sometimes family isn't what we're born into or what we're told it is. Sometimes it's what we discover, what we choose, what we build from the broken pieces of truth. Today, I live with him. I don't have the millions anymore. I donated them. But I have something money can't buy. The sound of his voice calling me Mom for the first time. It was on that day that I understood that I was never crazy. They just wanted me to appear that way. They say time reveals all truths, but sometimes the truth waits decades to emerge from shadows of deception. My story isn't just about the $320 million that appeared in my name. It's about how easily we can be erased when those closest to us decide we're inconvenient. How many elderly parents are silenced today, their concerns dismissed as confusion, their agency stripped away one doctor's appointment at a time. What would you do if you discovered your entire identity had been systematically dismantled by those who claimed to love you? In the end, the money never mattered. What I treasure most is hearing Thomas call me Mom, a word I thought I'd never hear from the child I was told had died. Our healing journey continues every day as we rebuild a relationship that was stolen from us both. The greatest wealth isn't found in bank accounts, but in genuine connection, in being truly seen and heard. Sometimes family isn't what we're born into, but what we choose to create from the broken pieces of truth. If my story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to reclaim your voice and your truth. Follow this channel for more stories of resilience and redemption that remind us all that even in our darkest moments, hope can find its way through. Like and comment below. I'd love to know if you've ever had to stand up against those who tried to make you doubt your own reality.